Hi, I'd like to read you a little bit of a book called 23 Minutes in Hell by Bill Wiese. This is entitled The Journey. He says, I've already shared with you the beginning of that journey on November 22nd, 1998. That was the night I was catapulted out of my bed into the very pit of hell. My point of arrival was a cell that was approximately 15 feet high by 10 feet wide and 15 foot in depth. With its walls of rough stone and rigid bars on the door, I felt as though I was in a temporary holding area, a place where a prisoner would await his final hours before meeting a far more terrifying destiny. In Isaiah 24, verse 22, the Bible says, "And they shall be gathered together as prisoners are gathered in the pit, and shall be shut up in the prison." King James Version. Proverbs 7, verse 27 refers to chambers of death in hell. As I lay there on the floor of that cell, I felt extremely weak. I noticed that I had a body, one that appeared just as it is now. Lifting up my head, I began to look around. Immediately, I realized that I was not alone in this cell. I saw two enormous beasts, unlike anything I had ever seen before. These creatures were approximately 10 to 13 feet tall. These towering beasts were far, far beyond intimidating. It is one thing to be threatened by someone much taller than you, but these creatures were not of this natural world. I recognized that they were entirely evil, and they were gazing at me with pure, unrestrained hatred, which completely paralyzed me with fear. Evil and terror stood before me. Those creatures were an intensely concentrated manifestation of those two forces. I still had no idea where I was, and I felt utterly panicked. Although I had no point of reference, no familiarity with anything I was experiencing, and no understanding of how I got here, still I was faced with the unimaginable reality that a torturous death seemed certain. The creatures weren't animals, but they weren't human either. Each giant beast resembled a reptile in appearance, but took on human form. Their arms and legs were unequal in length, out of proportion, without symmetry. The first one had bumps and scales all over its grotesque body. It had a huge protruding jaw, gigantic teeth, and large sunken eyes. This creature was stout and powerful, with thick legs and abnormally large feet. It was pacing violently around the cell like a caged bull, and its demeanor was extremely ferocious. The second beast was taller and thinner, with very long arms and razor-sharp fins that covered its body. Protruding from its hands were claws that were nearly a foot long. Its personality seemed different from the first being. It was certainly no less evil, but it remained rather still. I could hear the creatures speaking to each other, although I could not identify what language it was. Somehow I could understand their words. They were awful words, terrible, blasphemous language that spewed from their mouths, expressing extreme hatred for God. Suddenly they turned their attention toward me. They looked like hungry predators staring at their prey. I was terrified. Like an insect in a deadly spider's web. I felt helpless, trapped and frozen with fear. I knew I had become the object of their hostility, and I felt a violent evil presence such as I have never felt before, and greater than anything I could imagine. They possessed a hatred that far surpassed any hatred a person could have. And now that hatred was directed straight at me. I couldn't identify what these beasts were yet, but I knew they were meant for me, for harm. I wanted desperately to get up and run, but as I lay on that wretched cell floor, I noticed that I had absolutely no strength in my body. I could barely move. Why didn't I have strength? I felt so defenseless. In Psalms 88, verse 4, the Bible says, I am counted with them that go down into the pit. I am as a man that hath no strength. I knew that it was much more than physical weakness I was feeling. Indeed, it was weakness of every form. I was mentally and emotionally drained, even though I had only been there a few minutes. Most of us have experienced a loss of strength and energy after intense weeping, emotional distress, or grief. After a time of healing, we regain that strength, though it may take years. However, at the moment I felt that there would never be a time for recuperating from the literal weight that had fallen upon me, the weight of hopeless despair. Two more creatures came into the cell. I had the feeling that these four beings had been assigned to me. I felt as though I was being sized up, and that my torment would be their amusement. As they entered, suddenly the light vanished. It became absolutely pitch black. I had no idea why the sudden and intense darkness had began. But I sensed that the light that had been present had been an intrusion, and that the atmosphere had now returned to its normal state of darkness. In Lamentations 3:6, the Bible states, He has set me in dark places like the dead of long ago. One of the creatures picked me up. The strength of the beast was amazing. I was comparable to the weight of a water glass in its hand. And Mark 5, verses 3 through 4 describes a man possessed with a demon with these words, No one could bind him, not even with chains. The chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Instinctively, I knew that the creature holding me had strength approximately 1,000 times greater than a man. I cannot explain how I perceived that bit of information. Then the beast threw me against the wall. I crumbled onto the floor. It felt as though every bone in my body had been broken. I felt pain, but it was as if the pain was being somehow softened. I knew I did not experience the full brunt of the pain. I thought, how was it blocked? The second beast, with its razor-like claws and sharp protruding fins, then grabbed me from behind in a bear hug. As it pressed me into its chest, its sharp fins pierced my back. I felt like a rag doll in his clutches in comparison to his enormous size. He then reached around and plunged his claws into my chest and ripped them outward. My flesh hung from my body like ribbons as I fell again to the cell floor. These creatures had no respect for a human body. How remarkably it is made. I have always taken care of my body by eating right, exercising, and staying in shape. But none of that mattered as my body was being destroyed right before my eyes. I knew that I could not escape this torture via death, for not even that was an option. Death penetrated me, but eluded me. The creatures seemed to derive pleasure in the pain and terror they inflicted upon me. In Psalm 116, verse 3, it says, "The sorrows of death compassed me, and the pains of hell gat hold upon me. I found trouble and sorrow. Oh, how I yearned for death, but there would be none."